The harsh winter, where the air stings the skin, the ground freezes, and trees stand as bare specters in a terrifying stillness. This was not a scene from a fictional story, but a harsh reality experienced by people in the Middle Ages. Back then, winter was not just a season, but a beast that silently swallowed life. How did societies endure the grip of this frigid giant? How did hearts continue to beat, fires to blaze, and hope to endure while the earth froze around them? There were no heating systems, no streetlights, no stores overflowing with food. Every day was an adventure, and every piece of bread was a victory. This documentary is not about dates and battles, but about the daily struggle of the ordinary person, their simple tricks, and their innate intelligence in facing the power of nature. In the Middle Ages, the arrival of winter was not just a change of seasons, but an announcement of a long period of severe challenges. Temperatures were not only low, but their harshness extended for months on end, turning the world into a hostile environment. This winter was merciless, testing the resilience of people and their ability to endure. When the cold began, the wind was the first messenger of the frost-fierce winds, whistling through open fields and exposed villages, carrying with them icy snowflakes that stung faces and penetrated the weakest clothing. There were no barriers to protect against this natural force. Homes were simple, and windows were small openings that did not prevent the infiltration of the bitter cold. After the wind came the snow-heavy snowfall, covering the ground and roofs, turning roads into dangerous pathways and impeding movement and travel. Accumulated snow meant difficulty in accessing water sources and isolating villages from each other, halting trade and limiting the exchange of resources. In some areas, snow could last for weeks without melting. The freezing of rivers and lakes was another challenge. While ice provided new pathways for travel at times, it hindered fishing and the use of water for drinking and irrigation. Obtaining liquid water required extra effort, whether by breaking ice or melting snow. The lack of sunlight also had its impact. Days became shorter and nights longer and darker. This constant darkness, coupled with the cold, affected people's mental state and increased their feelings of loneliness and isolation in those harsh conditions. In this frozen landscape, winter showed no mercy. It imposed on everyone, from the farmer struggling in his field to the nobleman in his cold castle. Strategies for survival. These were not just choices, but a necessity for survival against the silent grip of time. The harsh winter in the Middle Ages was not limited to the outdoors. Even inside the most fortified homes, the struggle against the cold was continuous and intense. There were no central heating systems or effective insulation as we know them today, making every home a silent battlefield against the infiltration of the cold. For the majority of the population, homes were simple, built of wood, clay, or stone, and often had very small windows or just openings covered with animal skin or cloth to prevent wind infiltration. These houses lacked good insulation, meaning that the cold seeped in from every corner, forcing residents to constantly adapt. Fireplaces and open fires were the main source of warmth in the heart of every home. There was a fireplace or a fire pit where wood and coal were constantly burning. It was not just a simple fire-lighting task, but required constant effort to gather firewood, cut it, and ensure its availability throughout the long winter months. The smoke rising from these fires posed another health challenge, but it was a necessary price to pay for warmth. The heat emitted from the fires was not enough to warm the entire house. Therefore, the areas around the fire were the warmest and most used. Families would gather near the fireplace, sharing warmth, eating their meals, and sometimes sleeping as close to the fire as possible. This gathering was not just for warmth, but also strengthened family and social bonds in isolation. Conditions to enhance warmth. People used everything available. Multiple layers of clothing were worn indoors as well as outdoors. Thick woolen blankets and bedding made of straw or fur were used to cover bodies during sleep and to insulate against cold floors. In some wealthier homes, heavy curtains and carpets were used to insulate rooms and reduce heat loss. Even animals participated in providing warmth. Often, pets and even some small livestock were kept inside the house or in directly attached rooms where their body heat contributed to raising the room temperature slightly and helped in resisting the frost. Winter inside the home was a daily silent struggle. Every piece of wood burned, every layer of clothing worn, and every gathering around the fire was part of a complex and primitive survival strategy. This showed how societies managed to find warmth and safety, even in the darkest and coldest conditions. Harsh winter meant another enormous challenge: ensuring the availability of food. With the ground frozen, growth halted, and hunting becoming an almost impossible task in deep snow, the cold months were a true test of society's ability to plan, store, and withstand the silent hunger. Agriculture was the backbone of life, but depended entirely on the seasons. The harvest season in autumn meant the beginning of a race against time to gather as much food as possible. Grains like barley and wheat were ground and stored in silos or sacks, while root vegetables like turnips and carrots were buried in cold cellars or in the ground to protect them from freezing. These simple and primitive storage methods were the lifeline that ensured survival from hunger. Animals also played a vital role. At the beginning of winter, part of the livestock and poultry that could not be fed during the cold months were slaughtered. The meat of these animals was preserved using primitive methods. Salting, drying, and fermentation were among these methods. The meat was covered with salt to remove moisture and prevent spoilage. Then it was dried in the cold air or smoked over a fire to increase its shelf life. This processed meat was a primary source of protein and fat during the winter. Fish were no less important. In areas near coasts or rivers that did not freeze completely, fish were caught in large quantities and salted and dried using the same methods as meat. These fish were an important food source that compensated for the lack of fresh meat. Fermented foods like cheese, fermented bread, and some light alcoholic beverages also contributed to the diet. These foods not only provided calories, but also helped maintain general health due to their nutrient content. Every village and every family understood that failure to store food meant potential famine. Therefore, this process was managed with utmost care and was a fundamental part of community planning to face winter. The harsh winter in the middle ages was not just a physical challenge, but also had a profound and hidden impact on the human body and mind. In the face of constant low temperatures, lack of food, and social isolation, people faced silent health and psychological challenges that were no less dangerous than freezing or famine. Physically, extreme cold was the first enemy. Constant exposure to cold weakened the immune system, making people more susceptible to diseases. Colds, flu, and pneumonia were common and often fatal diseases, especially among children and the thin elderly. There were no antibiotics, and treatment relied on herbs and folk practices. Malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies were major problems during the winter. With reliance on stored foods that might lack some fresh vitamins, people suffered from a lack of essential nutrients. This deficiency affected energy levels, weakened the body, and increased susceptibility to diseases. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, may have spread in some communities lacking fresh fruit and vegetable sources. Cold-related injuries were also common. Frostbite and tissue freezing were real threats to exposed limbs, leading to tissue damage and amputation in severe cases. Falling on snow or ice caused bone fractures and other injuries, which healed very slowly in the absence of effective medical care. On a psychological level, the long and harsh winter significantly affected people's moods. The lack of sunlight, the isolation caused by disrupted movement, and the difficulties of daily life all contributed to feelings of depression and despair. This impact can be observed in some historical writings or records that speak of winter melancholy or the sorrow of cold days. These physical and psychological challenges were an integral part of the winter experience in the Middle Ages. They were not as overt as the apparent danger of the deadly cold, but silently crept in, placing immense pressure on human resilience and the ability to survive in such harsh conditions. In the face of the bitter winter, clothing in the Middle Ages was not merely for decoration or covering, but a vital shield for survival. In the absence of modern technology, people mastered the art of wearing multiple layers of fabrics and natural materials to provide maximum protection against the severe cold. The primary materials for clothing were wool, linen, and leather. Linen was used as an inner layer directly against the skin, as it helped absorb moisture and made the outer layers more effective in retaining warmth. Wool, however, was the most important fabric. Thanks to its natural properties, wool provided excellent thermal insulation, even when wet, and was used to make trousers, shirts, jackets, and blankets. The strategy of layering was crucial. People did not wear a single thick coat, but several thin layers on top of each other. This method created pockets of air between the layers, which acted as a natural insulator, trapping body heat and preventing it from escaping. The outer layers were often made of thick wool or even animal hides and fur to provide additional protection against wind and snow. Protecting extremities was of utmost importance to prevent frostbite, so gloves, hats, and wraps were essential. Gloves were made of thick wool or leather, and hats were crafted from wool or fur to cover the head and ears. Shoes were also made of leather, and sometimes stuffed with straw or wool to provide extra insulation for the feet. These garments were not limited to humans. In rural areas, working animals like horses and mules were covered with thick blankets to protect them from the cold, ensuring they remained capable of working when needed. The clothing of the Middle Ages was a silent testament to human ingenuity and skill in utilizing available resources. Every piece of clothing was made with care. Winter was not just a challenge for survival at home, but imposed a silent paralysis on all aspects of life and work. The rhythm of life changed drastically, and essential activities came to a halt, while new tasks imposed by the harsh cold emerged. Agriculture, the primary source of food, stopped entirely. Peasants who worked in the fields from dawn to dusk found themselves in a state of forced stagnation. The land froze, and farming became impossible. This period was not a time of rest, but one of waiting and anticipation, as peasants lived off what they had stored in the autumn, repaired their tools, and prepared for the next season. Trade and travel were significantly affected. Roads, which were already poor, became dangerous and unusable due to snow and ice. Rivers and lakes might freeze, hindering boat movement. This paralysis in movement led to the isolation of villages and towns from one another, halting trade and making available resources extremely limited. Even in cities, activities slowed down, and working hours were reduced due to the shorter daylight hours. Craftsmen and workers faced significant challenges working in their cold workshops. Keeping the workspace warm required a large amount of firewood, which increased production costs and reduced efficiency. Not all work came to a halt. New tasks emerged with winter. Gathering firewood became a vital and exhausting job. Men would venture out in groups to the forests to cut trees and collect branches, a dangerous task in the cold and snow. Snow removal from roads and buildings was another collective effort, ensuring life continued as much as possible. Amidst the silent paralysis. In the stillness, life took on a different rhythm. Social activities were concentrated indoors around fires. Stories were told, songs were sung, and handicrafts were completed. Winter imposed a kind of isolation, but also brought people together in their shared struggle against the cold, strengthening their social bonds in the face of the greater challenge. Asterisk. Winter also waged a silent and fierce battle against disease. With plummeting temperatures, poor nutrition, and limited hygiene, people's health deteriorated significantly, turning minor illnesses into life-threatening conditions. The bitter cold weakened the immune system, and prolonged exposure to low temperatures made bodies susceptible to colds, flu, and pneumonia, often fatal diseases in the absence of modern medicine. Children and the elderly were the most vulnerable, and historical records indicate a sharp rise in mortality rates during the winter months. Malnutrition played a critical role in this battle. Relying on stored, salted, and dried foods, people lacked essential vitamins and minerals to bolster their health. For example, a deficiency in vitamin C led to scurvy, causing gum bleeding, and weakness, making individuals more susceptible to other diseases. Frostbite was a common and serious threat. With work outdoors and during freezing periods, unprotected extremities like fingers, toes, and ears were prone to freezing. In many cases, these injuries led to permanent tissue damage or even amputation. Given the lack of effective medical care, hygiene was another issue exacerbated during winter. With difficulty accessing hot water and limited firewood for heating, bathing was rare, leading to the spread of skin diseases and lice. Overcrowded homes with poor ventilation were the perfect environment for respiratory diseases to thrive. The battle against disease in winter was silent and relentless. Treatments were primitive, relying on herbs and folk practices, often ineffective. This season represented a real health challenge, reminding us that survival in that era was not just about warmth and food, but also about the body's resilience against hidden and fierce threats. The harshness of winter varied greatly depending on social class. While nobles in their stone castles faced the cold with some luxury, peasants in their humble homes fought an existential battle for survival. Nobles lived in massive stone castles and palaces. Though generally cold and damp, these structures offered better protection against wind and snow compared to peasants' homes. Large halls were warmed by massive fireplaces, consuming vast amounts of firewood, ensuring relative warmth in central areas. Private bedrooms were equipped with smaller fireplaces, wool and fur furnishings, and heavy curtains to insulate against the cold. Food was not a significant issue for nobles. Their stores were filled with grains, salted meats, wine, and beer gathered during warmer months. They could endure winter without fear of famine and enjoyed indoor activities like feasts, games, and hunting in nearby areas, alleviating winter's boredom and isolation. In contrast, peasants lived in simple homes made of wood, clay, or straw. These dwellings were poorly insulated, with cracks allowing cold to seep in easily. Fireplaces were small, and firewood was a precious resource used sparingly. The only warmth came from families gathering around a small fire and the body heat of animals sometimes kept indoors. Food for peasants was scarce. Their lives depended entirely on the success of the summer harvest and their storage skills. Meals were limited to soups made from grains and root vegetables, with small amounts of salted meat. The threat of famine was real and constant, especially in years of poor harvests. While winter for nobles was a period of relative comfort and isolation, for peasants it was a silent battle against hunger, disease, and cold. This profound disparity in living conditions was a harsh reality of the Middle Ages, where the cold treated the poor more cruelly, while the wealthy mitigated its severity with privileges. In facing the unrelenting harshness of winter, people in the Middle Ages did not rely solely on material means for survival. Faith and belief played a crucial role in providing the psychological strength and hope needed to confront the cold and hunger. Churches and monasteries served as spiritual beacons in the darkness of the harsh winter. Winter was sometimes seen as divine punishment or a spiritual trial to purify the soul. This belief granted people patience and endurance, making each difficult day an opportunity to draw closer to God. Prayers were held regularly, and religious rituals were performed to seek mercy and salvation from the harsh weather. Churches and monasteries played an important social and material role in winter. They provided shelter and warmth for the homeless and poor and offered food stored from warmer months. The church was a refuge that brought people together in silence and reverence, offering a sense of belonging and security in isolation. Religious holidays celebrated in winter, such as Christmas, were periods of hope and joy. These celebrations, though simple, broke the harsh rhythm of winter, giving people a reason to gather and renew their hope for the arrival of spring. Songs were sung, stories were told, and meals were prepared from available stores, strengthening the spirit of community. Even in daily life, folk beliefs and superstitions were part of winter culture. People believed in spirits and ghosts inhabiting frozen forests and causing storms. These beliefs provided a way to explain natural phenomena they could not understand and gave them a sense of control over the unknown. Ultimately, faith was not just a means of dealing with the cold, but an integral part of the survival strategy. It provided psychological and social support that no wall could offer, and ignited a spark of silent hope in a time when frost threatened everything. People lived with a silent hope, watching for signs of winter's end and the arrival of spring, which would bring life back to the land. This transitional period from winter to spring carried its own challenges, but was also filled with hopes and aspirations. The first signs of winter's end were met with great joy. Melting snow meant rivers would flow again, allowing travel and trade to resume. Though melting snow sometimes caused muddy floods, these were considered a small price to pay for the return of warmth. The return of sunlight had a psychological and physical impact. Days grew longer, giving people new energy and a desire to work. Warm sunlight helped dry the land, lit up homes, and restored hope after months of darkness. As the frost receded, agricultural work gradually resumed. This period was the most important for peasants, who worked hard to prepare fields for planting. Sowing at the right time was crucial for a good harvest in the autumn, and this work was done with care and planning. The end of winter did not mean the end of difficulties. During this transitional period, stores were running low and resources were scarce. Hunger remained a threat, and people relied on what was left of winter food and any available food sources. The end of winter in the Middle Ages was a silent moment of change. There were no grand celebrations, just quiet aspirations and serious work. The return of spring was a promise of a better future and the beginning of a new cycle of life, igniting hope for survival until the next harsh winter. While rural villages faced winter in silent isolation, cities in the Middle Ages waged a different battle against the frost. In crowded cities, the cold took on other forms, adding unique challenges to people's lives. Although some comforts were more readily available, cities offered certain protections. Thick city walls acted as a barrier against fierce winds, and buildings were packed closely together, helping to block some of the cold. However, narrow, dark streets turned into icy, dangerous passages where snow accumulated and water froze. Heating was a major problem in cities. Although firewood was available for purchase in markets, its price soared during winter, becoming a burden for the poor. Families relied on open fireplaces that consumed large amounts of fuel and filled the air, with smoke in the absence of proper ventilation. Public health in cities deteriorated significantly in winter. Sanitation systems were primitive or non-existent. Accumulated waste in the streets, the presence of animals, and frozen water contributed to the spread of diseases and epidemics. Overcrowding made cities a breeding ground for respiratory and skin diseases. Despite these challenges, cities had some advantages. Trade did not come to a complete halt. Some merchants ventured across frozen roads. Markets remained open, though with limited goods, and churches and charities provided assistance to the poor and needy, alleviating hunger. Winter in the city was a struggle between warmth and isolation. People gathered in small cafes, taverns, or around workshop fireplaces, seeking physical and social warmth. The city was noisier than the countryside, but the frost cast its shadow, making every winter night a silent challenge for its inhabitants. In the Middle Ages, the impact of winter extended beyond daily life, touching people's souls and manifesting in their silent arts. Through paintings and illuminated manuscripts, artists of that era left us visual snapshots telling stories of the harshness of the cold, its gloomy atmosphere, and humanity's struggle against it. In visual art, snow-covered landscapes were common, but not always romantic as we might see them today. These paintings often depicted gray, dark scenes where snow fell in eerie silence. Trees stood bare, and houses and rooftops were covered in a cold white layer. These artistic representations reflected the reality of winter, a period of stillness, stagnation, and latent threat. Artists also portrayed life during winter in many paintings. We see peasants gathering firewood in frozen forests, families huddled around small fireplaces, or men and women heavily clothed, carrying heavy loads through the snow. These images were not just depictions of reality, but embodied a shared experience of effort and patience. In illuminated manuscripts, especially in books of hours containing annual calendars, the pages for winter months were adorned with illustrations showing distinctive activities for that period. These illustrations often depicted men and women warming themselves by the fire, slaughtering pigs for meat storage, or playing simple winter games. These snapshots gave us a glimpse into how people spent their time during that period and how they coped with it. Even in architecture, we see the influence of winter. The design of castles and houses was practical in facing the cold, with thick walls, small windows, and large central fireplaces. These designs, which may seem primitive to us today, were intelligent solutions to confront the harsh climate. Art and winter in the Middle Ages were two sides of the same coin. Art was a means for people to express their fear and hope, and a silent visual record of their challenges. Every painting and illustration was a story telling us how the human spirit could create beauty and resilience, even in the darkest and coldest times.